Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. Happy New Year to you. Happy Y2K25, as I've been calling it. Those of you who remember Y2K. Anyway, we'll get that. And also, Chag Sameach to those of you who are celebrating either the seventh day of Hanukkah or the eighth night of it, depending again on where you live in the world. It's great to be with you today and to start talking through we're going to do both the 10th and 11th chapters of the book of Daniel. Daniel 10, 11, and 12 are all a continuous prophecy. They make up a whole in the book of Daniel at the end of the book. So we're actually going to start in chapter 10 today to get some foundation for what is one of the most, if not the most, detailed and extensive prophecies in the Bible. I think maybe only Revelation 17, 18, 19 regarding Mystery Babylon may be longer in terms of word count. Anyhow, been looking forward to this and meditating on this. And those of you who have been following along with us and have been following along with The Wire, especially, and with the Revelation teachings. And I've said this before, I really believe with stronger and stronger conviction that the book of Daniel, especially chapter 11 and 12, hold a lot of value for us as we enter into what might be the earliest seasons of the end of the age. And I think it's important for us to know it and pick it apart, dissect it, spend some time exegeting it and marinating it, pray over it, and be watchful in the world today as we see things beginning to pick up both with increasing pace and intensity in the Middle East. And Daniel 11 gives a much larger regional picture of the eschatological scenario, you might call it, the end time scenario, the picture of the world, the landscape of the world, the biblical world, immediately preceding the return of Jesus. So it's not just about what's happening to the Jewish people in the land of Israel, but it also gives us detail about what's happening throughout the region. And kind of, in his genius and wisdom, God gives us a prophetic passage that both has a historical on-ramp, which for Daniel was a near future application, but for us is very distant years ago. Some of the historical events that we're going to be talking about today, including events that led up to the holiday of Hanukkah. So this is a timely lesson. So we can kind of look back at the historical applications or partial fulfillment, whatever you want to call it, of this passage to give us clues about what may be yet future. And so that's, I believe, a gift of God to us if we're willing to dig into it and spend some time going through that. So want to mention really briefly, obviously we reported about this on The Wire today or passed along some sources that there has been what appears at this point to be an ISIS-inspired terrorist attack on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, in the French Quarter, during New Year's Eve or New Year's morning celebrations. Somebody drove a truck, a Ford F-150 that had been smuggled across the Mexican border into Texas just a couple days before. Somebody with an Arabic name, who at this point is being reported was an American citizen and had served in the U.S. military, drove that vehicle into a crowd, continuing to pray for the people of New Orleans today, and ask that you would continue to, if you're near New Orleans, if you live in Louisiana, if you have any way of going to that community and serving, or getting in contact with churches in that community to find out specific ways that you can be praying, please do. And if you would, please share those things with us on the wire on X. We would love to play. Looks like we may have some technical difficulties here, guys. Okay. Looks like the stream may be freezing and coming back. Sorry if you're losing connectivity there. We come back, we're better now? Okay. It looks like my connection strength is excellent now. So that's good. So before I go on, I just wanted to bring that up and ask you to continue to pray for the people of New Orleans in particular. And without further ado, we're going to jump into this teaching. So I'm going to switch over to, I've prepared some slides here today. And some of this, if you listened to or watched our Revelation teaching on the rise of the Empire of the King of the North, that's one that I did 4 or 5 months ago, you'll be familiar with some of the elements of this teaching. Or if you've read the Wire special report on the ships of Katim, I'm going to draw from that as well a little bit. So if you haven't, I'd suggest maybe going back. You can Google FAI ships of Katim and read that article. It has a lot of great information that I'll be drawing from today. And also, if you haven't watched the Revelation, there's actually 2 videos that kind of did back to back on the King of the Norse kingdom in the Middle East and how we can relate it to events in the modern Middle East. I would highly suggest that. So I'm going to go ahead and kick into this slideshow here really quick. I'm not going to go full screen with it because I'm going to be clicking back and forth, but I just wanted you guys to be able to visualize the text as I'm reading it. Looks like we might be still having some connectivity issues. It says I have a good connection. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Renee says, yep. I'm getting every 12th word or so. Peter says, good. Okay. If you guys, I don't know if this would make a difference. If you might want to, so everything looks fine on my end. If you're having trouble still, maybe refresh your browser tab. But I'm getting lots of yes responses, so I'm glad to see that. Okay, so Lord willing, here we go. Daniel 10, 1 through 21. So I'll read a little bit at a time and then kind of pause and talk through what I'm reading and then go back to the text. So I've got kind of these paragraphs divided up into what I think are bite-sized chunks of verses that are grouped together in a way that would be helpful to go through this study. Okay, Daniel 10, verse 1. In the 3rd year of King Cyrus, king of Persia, Cyrus was the king that gave the decree to release the Jews from captivity after overthrowing the Babylonian Empire and allowed them to return to Judea and rebuild the temple. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. That was his Babylonian name. And the word was true, and it was a great conflict. And he understood the word and had understanding of the vision. This is the ESV, by the way, that I'm reading out of for those of you that are following along. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks. On the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris, this is in modern day Iraq, I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. If that description sounds familiar, it sounds somewhat like the description of Jesus, or very much like the description of the risen and glorified Jesus in Revelation chapter 1. This is not Jesus, we don't believe in this particular case, for reasons we'll get to in a few minutes. But this is certainly a divine heavenly being, an angelic being that's coming to visit Daniel by the banks of the Tigris River near Babylon. So, verse 7, and I, Daniel, alone saw the vision. For the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled to hide themselves. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, and no strength was left in me. And I use the Hebrew here because I really like the original description of this in the Hebrew language. My radiant appearance was fearfully changed, and I retained no strength. Then I heard the sound of his words, and as I heard the sound of his words, I fell on my face in deep sleep with my face to the ground. Verse 10, and behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly loved, understand the words that I speak to you and stand upright. For now I have been sent to you. And when he had spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. Then he said to me, fear not, Daniel, for the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God. This is partially describing Daniel's prayer in the previous chapter, chapter 9. Your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I was left there with the kings of Persia, and came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days. For the vision is for days yet to come. Excuse me if I cough during this, guys. I got a little cough that I'm battling here. So speaking of battling, there's a sort of heavenly cosmic battle going on in the description of this angel's arrival to Daniel near the Tigris River. It says he was on his way to Daniel after Daniel prayed. The first day that Daniel prayed to God and humbled himself before God in a prayer that you can read in chapter 9. He came to Daniel, and I don't understand how territoriality works or physical space works in the heavenly realms, but somewhere along the way he gets opposed by this other creature or being that appears not to be human. It's not referring to a human prince of Persia, which is modern day Iraq, but most likely a principality or power of some kind that opposed him and stopped him, hindered him from making it to Daniel. And so that's why we would believe this probably is not a reference to a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus, because Jesus, being the divine Son of God, wouldn't be held up by a principality. And this angelic being, as powerful as he is, was somehow opposed by this possibly even more powerful fallen principality and power, maybe, I don't know, over the kingdom of Persia. Maybe it's the cosmic power behind the human power, so to speak, if there's a sort of heavenly hierarchy there. And by the way, I might make reference to Michael Heiser's book, Unseen Realm, several times. If you haven't read that book, or maybe it's more concise and reader-friendly version called Supernatural, Dr. Michael Heiser's book is incredible. It's a great book. We don't necessarily agree with everything that he would teach in that book, and the way he taught on other subjects we would vehemently disagree with. But his work on the spiritual realm and his exegesis of passages like this passage, for instance, or like Genesis 6 or Deuteronomy 32, or some passages in Revelation, even when we get to Armageddon later, we'll talk about that. It's just brilliant. So he goes into depth in teaching on this particular passage, and I highly recommend it. So just on a little side here, he's opposed by this principality or power named the Prince of Persia, and is held up until Michael, the chief prince, so this is assumedly the archangel Michael, comes and battles against the Prince of Persia, which allows this angelic being to finish the task of reaching Daniel to give him this long explanation of this prophecy, this vision. So continuing on here in verse 15. Oh, and just again to point out, this is a prophecy again regarding your people, that is Daniel's people, the people of Israel, in the latter days. Okay, so there already the angel is giving context for the ultimate eschatological fulfillment of the events that will be described in chapter 11. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So picking up again in verse 15, when he had spoken to me according to these words, I turned my face towards the ground and was mute. Couldn't even talk in the presence of this being and hearing what he was hearing. And behold, one in the likeness of the children of man touched my lips. Now again, there's some disagreement among commentators and Bible scholars about who this one in the likeness of the children of man is. Now this is obviously similar language to Daniel chapter 7, when Daniel sees the vision of the one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven from the right hand of the throne in heaven. So that is why there are some that would say that this is a second being that appears to Daniel, who is in fact Jesus, which would mean that it's Jesus that's actually relating this prophecy, or he probably wasn't named Jesus at that point, but the Son of God, or God the Son, pre-incarnate, appearing to Daniel, relaying this prophecy. Another interpretation is that it's just the same angel being described differently, or possibly a different angel, a second angel, who is not the Son of God. Then I opened my mouth and I spoke. I said to him who stood before me, O Lord, by reason of the visions, pain have come upon me, and I retain no strength. How can my Lord's servants talk with my Lord? For now no strength remains in me, and no breath is left in me. Continuing on now to the end of chapter 10. And one having the appearance of a man, again describing the angel, or possibly pre-incarnate Son of God this way. One having the appearance of a man touched me and strengthened me. And he said, O man greatly loved, fear not. Peace be with you. Be strong and of good courage. And as he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, Let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. Then he said, Do you know why I have come to you? But now I will return to fight against the Prince of Persia. And when I go out, behold, the Prince of Yavon will come. We'll talk about Yavon in a minute. But I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is none who contends by my side against these except Michael, your prince. Okay, so that's chapter 10. Really briefly, I want to show you this map. This is from a Bible atlas showing the nations of the sons of Noah, as described in Genesis chapter 10, and how they spread out across the earth after the Tower of Babel. So you can see the nations highlighted in red here are Japhetic nations. Those are nations that came from Noah's son Japheth. And one of the sons of Japheth was Yavan, or that's often Romanized, anglicized as Javan. Um, the ESV and many other English translations translates that name as Greece. And in its historical context, that's not technically wrong. But the problem with that for us in the modern age is we understand when we're talking about Greece, we understand Greece to be here. I don't know if you can see my mouse pointer, but the peninsula of Greece here, all the way at the top left corner of the map, and some of the islands there along the Aegean Sea. But in the ancient world, Greece was much larger than just the modern nation state of Greece. There were several, Greeks would say in their mythology, in their history, four major tribes of Greek peoples, and the Ionians, being one of them, were called Eastern Greeks, and they settled here along the west coast of what is today Turkey. So most of what's called Asia Minor in the Bible, often in the New Testament, this part of Western Turkey here, historically, all the way up until really the 20th century, was culturally, linguistically Greek. Okay, this you can go all the way back to Helen of Troy, the Hellenic Wars, that epic of a movie with Orlando Bloom and Brad Pitt, if you've ever seen it before, depicts the battle between different Greek kingdoms, and Troy being a kingdom that was based here in Western Turkey. So, as I said, all the way through the Middle Ages, with the Hellenistic empires, Alexander the Great's empire, then the Roman Empire, and then the Byzantine Empire, which was really the heir of the Roman Empire, all the way until Western Turkey, what is today called Western Turkey, was conquered by the Turks, and then eventually, unfortunately, ethnically cleansed of Turks, or of Greeks, at the beginning of the 20th century when the modern nation state of Turkey was established. All the way up until then, Western Turkey was considered Greek in culture. So, like I said, it's not wrong necessarily technically to equate Greek with Yavon. The problem is that when we hear Greek, we think of the modern nation of Greece. But the Yavonite people, which is really more than just the Greek people, it's all the people groups that settled in here, what the Bible, the Old Testament, often refers to as the coastland peoples. Okay, they were seafaring peoples that populated all these islands in here, including one of the sons of Yavon named Kittim. We'll talk about more in a little bit. We have to understand that we're not just talking about Greece here. We're primarily, if Yavon and the cognate of Yavon is Iona, we're talking about Western Turkey more properly than we're talking about modern Greece. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you. I'll try not to get too deeply into the high school geography aspect of this passage, but I just want to point out that when we're talking about what English Bibles and maybe other modern versions in other languages translate as Greek or as Greece, we're really talking most properly about what is today the territory and the geography of the state of Turkey, okay, the Republic of Turkey. All right, so here we go with Daniel 11. We're going to take our time and do a marathon through this entire chapter. Hopefully the connection stays good here because we got 45 verses. Not sure how long we'll go. So hopefully you can stick around with us. And if at any time you got to drop off, don't worry. We will be posting this on YouTube later, so you will get to see the entirety of this teaching at your leisure. Okay. Chapter 11, verse 1, and we're going to read through the first 4 verses because they kind of set up the rest of the passage. And as for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, who was the ruler that Cyrus put in charge of the kingdom of Babylon, kind of under Cyrus, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. So this is again the angel speaking to Daniel. And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a fourth shall be far richer than all of them. This is a reference to King Xerxes. He was the one who tried to expand the Persian Empire into modern-day Greece. The famous Battle of Thermopylae, if you've seen the movie 300, depicts Xerxes' attempted invasion of Greece and how the Spartans stopped him with 300 men, 300 warriors. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all the kingdom of Yavon, that is the kingdom of Greece, as he goes through what is today Western Turkey and the Greek islands. As soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be, verse 3, then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And Bible commentators all universally agree this is a reference to Alexander the Great, who was from Macedonia. It's kind of in the northern part of Greece. So not exactly Greek in his ethnicity, but a Greek speaker and thoroughly Greek culture. His father, Philip II, had conquered what is today modern Greece. And then from there, Alexander, after his father's death, expanded the kingdom all throughout the modern Middle East, Central Asia, into parts of South Asia and North Africa. And we'll show some maps in a minute that show that kingdom. And he did all of that within a decade, in his mid-20s. And he just, basically his entire reign, his entire career was this massive military campaign throughout the known world at that time, which is most of the biblical world. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. So this is a description of the fact that in Babylon, actually, Alexander the Great died of a fever. Some speculate he may have been assassinated, poisoned, others that he died naturally of some kind of disease. And at the time, he had an unborn son by one of his wives, a wife named Cleopatra, who had not been born yet. And so there was this kind of regency that came into play. And the Diadochi, the leaders or successors of Alexander the Great, who were most of his primary advisors and generals, top generals, kind of divided up the kingdom temporarily and then eventually went to war with each other. And those different satraps or different parts of the kingdom were divided into separate independent kingdoms from one another. Okay, so this verse at the end of this slide here, verse 4, is a description of those events. So what happens next is in verses 5 through 13 that we're going to skip, and because they're not super pertinent to our conversation today, is a description of the narrative of the kings that followed. Once the Diadochi had kind of settled into the kingdoms, the independent kingdoms that would be established, the Greek kingdoms. So this is a map that I took from my previous teaching in the Revelation series, and you can see everything in green here is the kingdom that was eventually established over time and then expanded under the Seleucids. So Seleucid I was one of the leaders in Alexander the Great's military, and eventually established a kingdom in what is today modern Iran and Iraq, and expanded eastward and also westward into Asia. So he and his successors are described in Daniel 11 as the kings of the north. And you can see that the territory, at its height anyway, includes most of what would be modern day Turkey, all of Syria, Iraq, Iran, all the way up here. This is Uzbekistan, all the way up here, Afghanistan and Pakistan, and parts of India, all the way down here towards the Indus Valley. Okay, one of the other Dodoki was a man by the name of Ptolemy, and so his kingdom, which eventually became known as the Ptolemaic Kingdom, was based in Alexandria, Egypt. That's a city that Alexander the Great built here on the coast of Egypt, still the second largest city in Egypt to this day after Cairo. Was based here in Alexandria and included what you can see is just the northern tip of Saudi Arabia, all of Jordan, the Holy Land here, and then Lebanon, and then the eastern portion of Libya, and then Cyprus. Okay, so this is all very interesting when you consider the geopolitical layout of these nations in the Middle East today. So this is a map of the modern Middle East. The nations that are in red are nations that either have a formalized peace agreement or diplomatic relations with Israel in the darker red, or which are friendly towards Israel and are believed to be in peace negotiations with Israel. Okay, so those would be the red nations here. Libya, currently still in a decade-long civil war, is divided mostly west to east. And the eastern part of the nation, although it's not in talks with Israel right now, is allied with the al-Sisi government of Egypt. So it's considered to be the more moderate secular faction of the Libyan civil war, whereas here in the West, you have a regime that unfortunately is recognized by the United Nations, is technically the official government of Libya, and is supported by Turkey. Okay, so these are all nations that are either have diplomatic relations with or maybe are moving in that direction with Israel. Okay, the green nations are nations that are either openly hostile to Israel and have no diplomatic relations and are still technically at war with Israel. That would include Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Or in Turkey's case, Turkey, which was, I think, either the first or second nation to recognize the state of Israel in the late 1940s, and still technically has diplomatic relations with Israel, but obviously if you've been following The Wire, or FAI in general over the past few years, you know that under the, we could call it really at this point, the dictatorship of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey has become increasingly hostile to the state of Israel. So when you're comparing these two maps side by side, we can see that the kingdom, the Seleucid kingdom, the kingdom of the king of the north, is in many ways identical in territory to the nations that are today hostile towards the state of Israel. And that the territory of the Ptolemaic kingdom, the king of the south, based in Egypt, is also very similar in overlapping with the modern nation states that have either diplomatic relations with Israel or are friendly with Israel and moving in that direction. Okay, very interesting. And again, you know, as I mentioned earlier, that's why Daniel 11 is so important, because when we're talking about the king in the north and the king in the south, both in its historical context and in its eschatological end times context, we are today looking at a geopolitical layout in the Middle East that is similar to the one, obviously a modern one that is very different in some ways, but in its general contours and its general outlines, geographically speaking, very much similar to the one that existed in the 2nd century AD during the historical events that we'll talk about today. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is skip to verse 14. Verses 6 through 13 describe various kings of the north and kings of the south. They're never mentioned by name, so we kind of have to do our homework and figure out who these people were. And they're not even, it doesn't refer to them sequentially either. So it doesn't talk about the first king of the north and the second king of the north, or the first king of the south and second king of the south. It just always refers to them as the king of the north and the king of the south. But really, we're talking about multiple kings over both of these empires over the course of about 150 years. Okay. And it's not until we get to verse 21 where we're talking about only one particular king of the south for the rest of the chapter. And that's at verse 21 where the chapter takes a turn. And we'll get there in just a minute to talk about that. Okay, so before we get there, though, here's a little bit more of a setup for those verses. I'm going to talk a little bit about a man by the name of Antiochus III, called the Great. Okay, he's the father of the final king of the north of this passage, historically speaking. So starting at verse 14, in those times, meaning in the times we're talking about, many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violent, or the breakers or revolters, literally in the Hebrew, among your people, speaking to Daniel, so we're talking about the Israelites, shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. Okay, so this is in reference to a historical period where, going back to this map, you can see that the Ptolemaic Empire controlled the Holy Land in Lebanon. And for the most part, the Seleucid Empire, which is based right here in Antioch, which is in southern Turkey, modern Turkey, and also the Ptolemaic empires were pretty well deadlocked. It wasn't until this man, Antiochus III, rose to power that the balance of power began to shift. And what happened was there was an uprising against Ptolemaic rule in the Holy Land, and some of the Jewish people revolted against the Egyptian king in favor of the Syrian king, okay, or the king of the north. And so there was this uprising, which is what the angel here is referring to. And there was an attempt to overthrow Ptolemaic rule, but that, it says, failed. Ptolemy the Fourth, the king of the south at that point, came up and put down the rebellion. Antiochus III was distracted at that point in a different region of his kingdom in another war. So Ptolemy came up and put down this rebellion, and that provoked Antiochus to fight a war against Ptolemy. Okay, so that's going to be the following verses here. Then the king of the north, Antiochus III, the Great, shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city. That's a reference to Sidon in modern-day Lebanon. And the forces of the south, Ptolemy IV, shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. But he who comes against him, that is the king of the north, Antiochus III, shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which is a phrase used in Daniel multiple times in reference to the Holy Land, the land of Israel, with destruction in his hand. There's no evidence that Antiochus III was destructive towards the people of Israel. He is certainly destructive towards other nations. He seems to have been friendly towards Israel and tolerant towards the Jewish people, unlike his son, who we'll talk about shortly. He shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give them, now the next king of the south, Ptolemy V, the daughter of women, his daughter, to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. So this describes an interaction between Antiochus III, the king of the north, and Ptolemy V, the next king of the south, who at this time was only 16 years old. And at this point, Antiochus has fought a war against Ptolemy. He's taken the Holy Land from him. He's taken Sidon, which is in Lebanon, from him. And he could continue on into Egypt and take over the Ptolemaic kingdom, the entire kingdom of the king of the south, but he doesn't do that. He stops in what is today Rafah, the city on the border of the Gaza Strip and Egypt that's been in the news quite a bit lately. And he offers his daughter, Cleopatra the first, to Ptolemy the fifth, the 16-year-old boy, and forges an alliance with him. His scheming in this, his idea in this, is through his daughter to influence the king of the south. The reason why he does this without fighting a continual war against the king of the south is because at this point in history, the empire of Rome, it's still a republic at this point, but it's a growing empire, territorially speaking, is in league with some of the Greek states in what is today modern Greece. And Antiochus doesn't want to fight a war against Rome. So instead of provoking them into war as well, he takes a Holy Land from Ptolemy and then he offers his daughter to him in the hopes that he can kind of rule the Ptolemaic kingdom through his daughter. What ends up happening is his daughter turns against him and actually makes an appeal to Rome with her husband on behalf of her husband, the king of the south. So Antiochus's plot doesn't work so well, which is why it says here in the text that he shall give him, Ptolemy the fifth, the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. It doesn't work out the way Antiochus wanted it to. I'm telling you this because it kind of sets up the family dynamic in the rest of the passage that involves the final king of the north. Okay, so Ptolemy the fifth marries the daughter of Antiochus, and they have kids, which means that Antiochus's children, sons, are uncles, right, to the children of Ptolemy the fifth. They're related to each other. So both these royal families are now going to be intermarried and interrelated with one another. Picking up verse 18, afterwards he shall turn his face, he being Antiochus, king of the north, shall turn his face to the coastlands and capture many of them. Remember, I said earlier the coastland people was a reference to the Yavanites who settled, I'll go all the way back up to this slide really quick, settled here in this portion of the Aegean Sea, Greece, the island of Rhodes here, even including Cyprus and western Turkey. So after Antiochus III wins this great war against the Ptolemaic kingdom and puts his daughter on the queen's throne in Alexandria, he then goes and fights another war against the Greek kingdoms up here that he did not yet at that point control. And so he turns his attention to the coastlands. And this is where he's going to start a war and provokes the very thing that he was hoping to avoid provoking, which is the Roman Empire that's going to come to the aid of these Greek city-states up here. So going back to our text, afterwards he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall capture many of them, but a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. That is a reference to a famous Roman general named Lucius Scipio, who won a battle against, this great battle against Antiochus III. I believe it was near Thermopylae, the same area where the Greeks beat the Persians, and turns Antiochus back. For this, he was given this honorific title of Scipio Asiaticus, because he had won this great battle in Asia Minor. And so here, again, this is backstory for the final king of the north, something to understand, is here we have the Western power intervening in what is today would be considered a Middle Eastern war in the modern nation state of Turkey, to restore a balance of power. Okay? So the role of the Western European powers throughout Daniel 11 is not necessarily always to take one side over another, but it's to kind of keep the king of the north contained, to not allow his power to grow too great. Okay? And when he begins to kind of exceed his territory too much, or begins to subdue too many of his enemies, begins to become too rich and powerful, that's when the Western powers intervene to put him in check, to turn him back. And so we see the first example of that here with Antiochus the Great, where the Roman generals make a league with some of the other Greek kings of Western Asia and modern Greece, and they turn Antiochus back. It says, indeed, they shall turn his insolence back upon him. Then he shall turn his face back towards the fortress of his own land. He goes back to, what is today's Syria, southern Turkey. But he shall stumble and fall and not be found. He was assassinated not long after that while raiding a pagan temple in modern Iran. Then shall arise in his place, speaking about his son, Seleucus IV, Philopator, or friend of the Savior, one who shall send an exactor of tribute. And you can read more about this event in the apocryphal book of 2 Maccabees, for the glory of his kingdom. So this is describing the son of Antiochus III, who came to power after his father was assassinated. And in the book of 2 Maccabees, it describes an event where Seleucus IV, this next king of the north, sends an exactor of tribute, a tax collector essentially, to demand tribute from the Jewish people, taking treasures and gold out of the temple treasury. Okay, so that's described in 2 Maccabees 3, for the glory of the kingdom. This man that he sent, this exactor of tribute, his tax collector, was a man named Heliodotus. This guy actually went back and assassinated that king of the north, Seleucus IV, and was soon after, in turn, assassinated himself. Okay, so this is kind of the historical context for what's going to come with the final king of the north. Another quick backstory for you. After Antiochus III was beat by Rome, they demanded in the peace agreement, in addition to lots of money, that Antiochus turn over one of his sons to live in Roman captivity, to live as a Roman prisoner. And this was a tactic to make sure that Antiochus didn't rebel against or break the deal with the Romans, is because they were essentially holding one of his sons hostage. So Antiochus turned over to the Romans his youngest son, who would become known as Antiochus IV, the God-man. It was his title that he gave himself, which is interesting when we talk about the eschatological meaning of his name. Antiochus became a Roman prisoner, lived in Rome for a decade. He was the youngest son of Antiochus, so he is not in line to the throne. His nephew was, his older brother's son. And during his time in Rome, he spent a lot of time around Roman politicians, Roman culture, the Roman lifestyle, and became a very astute politician. And this would serve him very well a decade later, after his older brother was murdered by Heliodotus, by the tax collector. And he saw his opportunity to seize power. Okay, so Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, or the God face, the God-man, so to speak, is his title for himself, also called the Madman, would be the final king of the north. And when we read about the final king of the north in verses 21 through 45, historically speaking, that is the man. Okay, so that is the archetype for the ultimate eschatological end times king of the north, the Antichrist, the man of sin. So after the death of Seleucus IV, Antiochus is released, and one of Seleucus's sons is taken captive, because now Seleucus is the king, so Rome wants doesn't want the brother of the king, they want one of the sons of the king. So Antiochus is released in exchange for one of the new king's sons. And that king is then the heir to the throne. So at this point, the son of Seleucus IV that's left as the king of the north in Antioch is a younger son of Seleucus, and he's too young to rule. So there needs to be a regency, or there needs to be someone ruling with him, because I can't remember how old he was. I think he was like 9 years old or something. He wasn't old enough to rule the kingdom yet. And the eldest son, who had the right to rule the kingdom, was a prisoner in Rome. So Antiochus IV saw his opportunity. And that's where we're going to pick up here in our key verses for today. So again, from now on, when we're talking about the king of the north, for the rest of this passage, we're only talking about one man historically and one man eschatologically. And this is where the narrative turns and focuses on this one individual for the rest of the chapter. And there are some mentions of the king of the south, but that figure kind of fades away, and the king of the north, this final one individual, is the prominent individual for the rest of this passage. Okay, so here I'm going to break down the verses even phrase by phrase, because each one of these are individual qualities of this individual. Okay, so starting in verse 21. In his place shall arise a contemptible person. The Hebrew could be translated as despicable or vile person. Not a cool guy. To whom royal majesty has not been given. In other words, Antiochus was not in the line of succession. His captive nephew was. Right? So if we're looking at this passage both with historical application and with eschatological application, then here's where we're going to begin looking at the qualities of this individual and gaining an understanding of both his personality and his character and his rise to power. Right? So Antiochus IV, being a very immoral man, a very despicable man, comes to power without having the royal majesty bestowed upon him. He is not the rightful heir to the throne. In the modern context, that could also be, if we're talking about a monarchy, could be this individual is not in the line of succession of that monarchy. Or if we're talking about a democracy or a pseudo-democracy, it could be an individual that takes power without being rightfully elected to his position. Just some possible modern applications. He shall come in without warning. So he shall take power quickly over his kingdom and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Okay, so this is where Antiochus IV's political training and background comes into play. Is he spent a decade in what was at that point the budding political capital city of the ancient world, which is Rome, around some of the most skilled career politicians in the ancient world at that time. So he knew how to be a politician. That is, he knew how to flatter the people he had to flatter, and knew how to step over and step on the people he needed to step on and step over. Okay, he knew how to be an astute politician. And using these skills, he comes into power in this kingdom quickly, without warning. In his initial military campaigns to take over the kingdom, it says, armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the Prince of the Covenant. I won't get into what the Prince of the Covenant is today. That could be its own 2-hour teaching. But just to make the point that he has this initial military campaign that allows him to come into power very quickly and sweep away his military opposition. So he's both a good politician who knows how to schmooze the people he needs to schmooze, but he's also an adept military tactician and military commander who can quickly achieve his military objectives to secure the kingdom. And from the time he makes an alliance, or from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. So the historical application to all this is Antiochus IV, having been released from Rome, spends a little bit of time in Greece, what we would consider modern Greece. And during that time, he makes an alliance with the king of Pergamum. Pergamum was a Greek city-state, going back to our map here, somewhere around here on the coast of modern Turkey. In fact, it's one of the 7 churches of Revelation that Jesus writes to. You can go see the ruins of the church of Pergamum today in Turkey. During that time, obviously, it was a pagan city. And Antiochus made an alliance with the king of Pergamum, and with his army swept into, I'm sorry, let me get back to my, sorry, my slides are kind of lagging here, guys. With his army sweeps into the Seleucid kingdom. So he makes an alliance with a small army, with this army of the king of Pergamum, but he takes the kingdom of the north unawares, partly because at that point it was fairly weak. It was under a co-regency with a young boy, and the kingdom was in a little bit of disarray. There was some power struggle going on at the top in the king's court, and nobody expected Antiochus to come out of nowhere with this army, Greek army from Western Turkey, and just go straight for Antioch and take the city, which is essentially what happened in 175 BC. So very similar to some historical events that just transpired recently in Syria last month, with a particular individual and his small people from the province of Idlib who, within a matter of a week and a half, broke out of Idlib province and drove straight to Damascus within a few days and took the city without warning. Not saying that he's the final king of the north, but it's just interesting that that transpired the way it did, and thought I should point it out. So he says, armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that the alliance is made with him, that is with the king of Pergamum, he shall act deceitfully and shall become strong with a small people. So those are kind of the qualities, the characteristics of this final king of the north, and his rise to power over the kingdom, over the Seleucid kingdom historically, and over what will eventually be, we know from the book of Revelation, a 10-nation confederation at the end of the age. Okay. Verse 24, without warning he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. So he has this incredibly successful, lightning-fast, unexpected military campaign that takes control of this empire, historically the Seleucid Empire, under Antiochus IV, and then again, eschatologically, with the final king of the north. And this, in turn, provokes the king of the south. So verse 25, and he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. The king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great army, great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. So after Antiochus IV came to power, he ruled for a little while with his younger nephew, and then his nephew then 5 years later died under mysterious circumstances. And Antiochus became the sole ruler of the Seleucid Empire, the sole king of the north. And this in turn provoked the king of the south, Ptolemy VI at this point of the Ptolemaic Empire, to wage war against Antiochus. Okay, so there's this war, this first of three wars against the final king of the north and final king of the south. Keeping in mind, the king of the south is based in modern-day Egypt and has an empire that spreads from eastern Libya across Egypt, Sudan, and to the Persian Gulf, okay, including Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and what would be modern-day Oman in the Gulf states. Okay. So it says that in this first war, there's these huge armies that come against each other, but the king of the north prevails. And historically speaking, Antiochus won the first war against his nephew and took the city of Alexandria and plundered it and kind of semi-deposed his nephew in favor of another nephew. He kind of set up this crisis of leadership in the Ptolemaic Empire to keep the kingdom weak. And then he withdrew. And so this is a reference in the text to that sort of infighting within the Ptolemaic Empire that led to the empire being weakened, that the king of the south was opposed by those who sat at his table, some in his court who sided with his brother against him. Ultimately, the brothers reconciled and the crisis was averted. But for the time being anyway, there was dissension within the Ptolemaic Empire that led to something that looked like a civil war, or an insurrection, a coup at least. So today, interestingly, if you read about al-Sisi's, President al-Sisi's response to the rise of the new regime in Turkey, or I'm sorry, in Syria, there are concerns that something similar could happen in Egypt. At the beginning of the Arab Spring in 2011, there was a popular uprising which led to the resignation of President Mubarak at that time, one of the mentors of President al-Sisi, who was the dictator over Egypt for 30 years. And an Islamic government came into power, was democratically elected. This was the Muslim Brotherhood Party that was led by Mohammed Morsi. And that government was essentially elected into power for about a year and a half. Then there was a counter-revolution, and that's when al-Sisi came back into power with most of the military establishment that had ruled Egypt before. And it continues like that to this day, about 15 or so years later. So I'm not suggesting that's that's not necessarily the eschatological fulfillment of these verses, but I just want to point out that there is dissension within Egyptian society and within Egyptian politics and the Egyptian government, and concern that there are Islamist elements in Egypt which pose a threat to the Egyptian regime to this day. And the success of al-Jawlani, former al-Qaeda leader in Syria, he would say former al-Qaeda leader anyway, there is concern that this could lead to another Islamist revolution or uprising in Egypt. And President Sisi actually had to come out on TV shortly after Damascus fell and say, but don't worry guys, nothing like that's going to happen here. Egypt, although it is ruled by a secular dictatorship and has a peace agreement with Israel, is nonetheless the birthplace of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the grandfather of most of the strains of jihadism in the Middle East today, including Islamic Jihad, including Hamas, including Al-Qaeda, including ISIS, including Al-Nusra Front, which became HTS, which is al-Jawlani's party in Syria. So although a secular dictatorship currently rules over Egypt, there's always this undercurrent of threat by Islamist political parties and this concern that possibly there could be another revolution. So again, if we're looking at this passage from an eschatological perspective, we could expect that at some point there would be a war between the king of the north and the king of the south, after the king of the north seizes the kingdom. And when that war takes place, that the king of the north will win that particular conflict, partly because of the division in Egyptian politics, or in the politics of the nations of the kings of the south. That although those kings are not friendly to Islamism, they have major portions of their kingdoms, of their nations, that are friendly to Islamism, that are hostile to Israel. Okay, and so that will always be a mitigating factor for their power and for their rule, and will keep them weak in comparison to the king of the north. Okay, so just wanted to point out that dynamic for future reference. As for the two kings, their hearts shall be, verse 27 here. As for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail. For the end is yet to be at the time appointed. And he, that is the king of the north, shall return to his land with great wealth. But his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. Okay, that's going to be a recurring theme in this passage that we need to keep in mind. And he shall work his will and return to his own land. So, king of the north wins the first round of wars between the two kingdoms. They sit at the table together in front of the news cameras and shake hands and act like everything's okay and they've made up, and maybe they win the Nobel Peace Prize and everything looks great, and the world loves the king of the north again because he's such a great peacemaker. He's a great military leader, but he's also a great politician and a great peacemaker. And he goes back to his capital, richer and more powerful than ever, secretly in his heart, storing up hatred for the Holy Covenant. That is, for the God of the covenant and his covenant people. Okay, so all the while this man is in power, although he speaks peace, and even in the midst of war talks about peace and making peace and being tolerant, he is all the while in his heart set against God and his covenant people. That never leaves his heart and mind, okay, throughout this whole chapter. And at some point in the very near future, in fact, the next couple of slides here, it's going to be exposed for what it is. Verse 29. At the time appointed, he shall return and come into the king of the south. Come into the south, but it shall not be like it was before. So historically speaking, this is a reference to, remember I said there were kind of two Ptolemaic brothers that were put on the throne together to rule together as co-regents, and that was to kind of set up a rivalry between them. And this is kind of Antiochus's, brilliant political design to keep the Ptolemaic kingdom, to keep his nephews weak. But that ultimately failed because a younger brother again swore fealty or swore loyalty to his older brother, Ptolemy VI. And then the brothers together appealed to Rome against their uncle, Antiochus the fourth, the king of the north. So this upset Antiochus. And so comes the second war out of the three between the kings of the north and south. So it says, at the time appointed, he, the king of the north, shall return and come into the south. But it shall not be this time as it was before. Antiochus swept through first Cyprus and then down into Egypt and took all the major cities of Egypt and surrounded Alexandria, the capital, and besieged it. But before he could take the city, comes verse 30. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, Historically, this is a Roman delegation led by a Roman delegate named Gaius Pompilius. And he, the king of the north, shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged to take action against the Holy Covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So this second war is the turning point in the reign of the king of the north. And you could say the turning point in the 70th week of Daniel. And it's the event that immediately precedes, that catalyzes his rage to be enacted against the Holy Covenant. Historically, what this was as Antiochus had the city of Alexandria surrounded, this man, Gaius Pompilius, came to him as a Roman delegation and said, "You withdraw from the city now, or you've got war." Antiochus wanted to stall so he could have time to consult with his advisors and figure out what they were going to do. And Gaius very famously drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and said, "Do not step out of this circle until you have an answer for me to take back to the Roman Senate." And Antiochus, in front of this crowd, was humiliated. He knew he could not go to war against the Ptolemaic kingdom and the Romans and all their allies. Then he would have been in a two-front war that he couldn't fight. So he withdrew in disgrace. And this delegation that comes from Rome is described in the prophecy as the ships of Kittim. Now again, for more backstory on this, you can go back and read our article, the Wire special report on the ships of Kittim. But for now, just going back to our map, Kittim was Cyprus. Okay, so Kittim was one of the sons of Yavon. Yavon and his descendants settled here on the southeastern quarter of Cyprus. In fact, they had a port here named Kytios. In Greek, it was called Kytios. And so most properly, when you're standing on the coast of Israel, in fact, on a clear day, you can see the coast of Cyprus from Israel. So literally, the Israelites could look out from the coast of the Holy Land and see the territory of Kittim here in southeast Cyprus. And so keeping in mind that when we're talking about interpreting these passages, we're doing it from this Judeo-centric, this Hebreo-centric viewpoint that begins in the land of Israel and goes out to the rest of the world. From the viewpoint of the prophets in the land as they look out on the coastland nations, the first point of reference they have for those coastland peoples out here are the people of Kittim in Cyprus. Okay, so by extension then, not only Kittim, but all the coastland peoples and their linguistic and cultural and ethnic heirs that spread out across the continent of Europe over time, Greco-Roman culture, and then ultimately to North America, the United States and Canada, could by extension be considered the peoples of Kittim. Okay, and often when the peoples, the seafaring peoples sailed from these nations, the last stop that they would make before making port either in the Holy Land, maybe here in Jaffa, or up north in Tyre and Sidon, would be Kytios, would be this port. So literally the Israelites would see ships from all of these nations of the Western world coming from Kittim. So not just geographically talking about this little corner of Cyprus, but the ships of Kittim, the ships themselves can include any one of these Western nations and beyond. Okay. So here, there's an obvious reference to delegation from Rome, but they are referred to as the ships of Kittim. If you read the book of Maccabees, the first book of Maccabees, the very first verse of the first chapter, Alexander the Great, although he's Macedonian, is referred to as coming from the land of Kittim. Well, he didn't come from Cyprus. So it was generally understood in the ancient world in the Jewish holy writings, which Maccabees isn't a biblical book, but it's written by men who had biblical books for reference, Kittim was understood to be the western nations, the coastland nations of Greece and beyond in the continent of Europe. So Antiochus IV is stopped in Alexandria, turned back, and disgraced. Historically, what happened after this is what leads up to the Jewish tribulation, the Jacob's trouble of that generation. And that is a rumor spread that Antiochus had been assassinated. He hadn't been, but in the ancient world, obviously, you don't have Twitter and you don't have TV or the news. And so you don't know whether a rumor may or may not be true. It was just, it's kind of the ancient version of the telephone game where Antiochus was stopped by the Romans, and him being turned back somehow turned into he was killed. And by the time that news got to the Holy Land, there was this belief that Antiochus was dead. So there were different Jewish factions within Jerusalem at that time. One that was pro-Greek, that had been installed to rule over Jerusalem by Antiochus, who still controlled the Holy Land at that point, after it had been taken by his father. And then there was a pro-Ptolemaic or pro-Egyptian faction. And there were two competing high priests, one of them named Jason, who Antiochus had deposed and placed in over the high priesthood, a man named Menelaus. Okay, so that's kind of the backstory for this. When the rumor got to the Holy Land that Antiochus was dead, Jason and his faction that had been kicked out of power started an uprising and drove Menelaus out of the high priesthood and took the Temple Mount back from them, took the city back from Antiochus's faction. So historically speaking, that is what caused Antiochus to become enraged and to take action against the Holy Covenant. He already had hatred for the Holy Covenant in his heart. He wasn't like his father. And when he heard on his way back from Alexandria that Jewish rebels had ousted his hand-picked high priest and taken control of the city, he flew into a rage and sent his army to put down this rebellion. And that's when we come to the events of the book of Maccabees, the Maccabean revolt, the Hasmonean Wars, as they're called historically. Here's another biblical reference, the last oracle of Balaam to Balak in the book of Numbers 24, verses 23 and 24, right after he gives the messianic prophecy about the star rising out of Jacob from Judah. He makes a reference to Kittim. He says, and he took up, that is Balaam, took up his discourse and said, alas, but who shall live when he, the king of the north, in our passage, does this? But ships shall come from Kittim and shall afflict Asher and Eber. That is the Middle Eastern Semitic people groups. And he too shall come to utter destruction. So this is again a reference to the ships of Kittim, or the Western nations, subduing the Middle Eastern people groups. And I go into detail about how this has happened historically in the article throughout the last 2,500 years, since Antiochus was stopped by Gaius in Alexandria. But all this, again, to keep in mind the dynamic here, is that when the king of the north, Turkey, Syria, and northern Iraq, wherever he comes from, when the king of the north becomes too strong and overplays his hand against his regional enemies in the south, that's when the Western powers intervene. Not to depose him, not to throw him out of power, but to stop him. And it's at that stopping point where the king of the north, although he's winning the second war, is halted and thwarted and turned back. That's the point at which his rage against the Holy Covenant that he's been holding in his heart overflows, and he goes to rage against the covenant in the land. So historically, that was Antiochus. and his army going to Jerusalem to put down this rebellion. Eschatologically, we can expect to see a second conflict with intervention from Western powers result in the beginning of the Great Tribulation. Okay? And we see that dynamic at play in the region already. Already, Western naval ships and air forces, the modern versions of the ships of Kittim, are off the eastern Mediterranean coast or in the Red Sea or in the Persian Gulf, restraining the powers that are warring against each other. So already we see that dynamic of restraint at work by Western powers and the interventionism that comes into play when one faction becomes too strong. And really what it comes down to is threatens the political balance of power and threatens the economic interests of the nations of Kittim. Okay, that's ultimately what this is about, is the nations of Kittim getting hit in the pocketbook and there being too much political imbalance and them coming to restore that balance, right? So in this passage, I'll read the angel's description of this Jacob's trouble, and we'll talk about both the historical and future eschatological fulfillment. Verse 31. Forces from him, that is the king of the north, shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. So if we're talking about an eschatological future fulfillment of this passage, that means that there are burnt offerings, Jewish Levitical sacrifices. The sacrificial system is reinstituted on the Temple Mount in order for him to profane the temple and take the sacrifices away. Those have to be pre-existing. That is not the case yet, so that is still a to be fulfilled portion of, or to be realized portion of this prophecy. And they, that is the forces of the king of the north, shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. So there shall be an abominable thing that is set up in the temple that shall lead to desolation. This is the verse that Jesus quotes in Matthew 24, his Olivet Discourse, and says, let the reader, that is the reader of Daniel, understand. This is the singular event in the prophetic timeline leading up to the day of the Lord that we are most acutely to be aware of and to look for. Okay, so events that precede this, I think we'll be able to recognize. At some point, I think we'll be able to recognize who this man is and his 10-nation confederation and the covenant that he makes for 1/7, the 70th week of Daniel. I think we'll probably be able to recognize those things when they happen. But this is the event that Jesus says, this is what you're watching for. When you see this happen, flee from the city to the wilderness. Get out of the city immediately. So here's a very specific description of a very specific event taking place in a very specific location that we are to watch for. This is at the midpoint of the week, according to Daniel 9, and the beginning of the final Great Tribulation, eschatologically. Historically, what this was Antiochus taking over the temple, eventually erecting a pagan idol, a statue of the god Zeus on the temple, and then beginning pagan worship in the temple, which according to the book of Maccabees was very licentious, shall we say. Temple prostitution, sacrifices of animals like pigs on the altar. So he profanes the temple. He sets up this abominable idol in the middle of the temple, in the middle of God's temple. And this leads to desolation in the city of Jerusalem and throughout Judea, and in the wars that will follow in the following verses. It says, he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. So there were those within Israel Jewish people that allied with Antiochus against their own people and against the covenant. And so we could expect, unfortunately, to see a future eschatological fulfillment of that. Some of the Jewish people turning against their own people, against the God of their own covenant, being seduced by this king of the north. But at the same time, the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise, in Hebrew, literally hamaskalim, the wise ones, comes from the Hebrew verb sakal, meaning prudent or discerning, can also be translated prosperous or successful in some contexts. Talk more about that in a minute. The wise among the people shall make many understand. So there's this group of people in the midst of this persecution, in the midst of this rebellion and this apostasy of the covenant people. There are some who know their God. There are some who stand firm and take action. And their role during this time is to make many understand. Okay, so they have a prophetic role. I say this most immediately refers to Jewish believers, but even more broadly to Gentile believers grafted in to the covenant tree, in the churches, in the nations, that have this role of making many understand. As the love of many grows cold, as many are deceived by this individual who seduces them and flatters them and apostatizes out of the churches, leaves the faith, betrays the churches and the believers in the churches. And within Israel, those who betray their own people. As this is happening, there are some who remain faithful to the covenant, to the God of the covenant. And they're called the wise ones, the prudent ones, the discerning ones, the ones who prosper and who are successful. Or you can maybe interpret that as being fruitful or overcomers, as they're often referred to in the book of Revelation. And we know from Revelation chapter 7 that there are 144,000 from the 12 tribes who are sealed throughout this time, Jewish people who are sealed throughout the Great Tribulation. And we believe it is both their role and the role by extension of us, believers out in the churches, in the nations, to be the wise ones who know our God and who shall make many understand. Okay? So this is, I think, one of the most applicable passages for us. And if there's a portion of this passage that we need to meditate upon and pray over, that we might be ready and prepared and found awake and sober-minded with oil in our lamps during this time, it would be this portion of the passage. We want to be the wise ones. We want to be the Maskalim, because it's not going to be easy for them. Though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. Okay, so these wise ones, some of them are martyred. Some of them are taken in captivity. Some of them have everything they own stolen from them. They're plundered. We don't know how far beyond the land this goes. Historically speaking, we're only talking about the land of Israel. We're not talking about anything beyond that in Antiochus' reign. Eschatologically, obviously, we're talking about a tribulation throughout the nations that to one degree or another touches every nation. So it will not be an easy time for the Maskalim. They're going to be martyred and plundered and taken into captivity. As it says in Revelation 13, I believe it is, to he who is destined or prepared for captivity, into captivity he will go. To he who is to be killed by the sword, he shall be killed by the sword. And we are encouraged to meditate on this in the book of Revelation. So their overcoming, their prosperity, their success is not based on worldly standards. Because the guy who's successful from a worldly standard at this time is the king of the north. He's the one with military power and economic riches, and who is overcoming and conquering the saints, as it says in Daniel chapter 7. But at the same time, the Mascalim are conquering in their own sense. In what sense? They're making many understand. They're remaining faithful, even though they're being martyred and imprisoned and plundered. Verse 34, when they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end. This is the overcoming that Jesus exhorts the churches to in Revelation. Be refined, be purified, made white until the time of the end. What happens at the time of the end? The bride has made herself ready, spotless, radiant, to be married to the bridegroom, as it says in Ephesians chapter 5. So that's our overcoming, is to be refined, purified, made white, and ready for the arrival of the King. But for a while they're going to stumble. We're going to go through some hard times. We're going to make some mistakes. We're going to have some weaknesses and failures. But that's God's process of chastening us and disciplining us and refining us and purifying us until the appointed time. And same, I would say, for the Jewish believers who remain faithful to God in the land during this time. I'm just going to read a couple passages from 2 Maccabees. Again, this is a deuterocanonical book. It's an apocryphal book. It is not part of the canon of Scripture. It is included with, I think, if you have Catholic Bible, they do a Reims Bible, or I'm not sure if the Orthodox Bible has the Apocrypha included. Maybe somebody can comment on that. Some Anglican Bibles also include the Apocrypha. I have an Anglican Bible that kind of has it segmented in the middle between the Old and New Testaments. So this is not inspired Scripture, but it is a historical document that draws from Scripture. And so this passage gives a description of the historical fulfillment of what we're reading about in Daniel 11. Okay, so let me highlight the whole thing. I'll just read through the first few verses here at the top. When news of what had happened reached the king, that is Antiochus IV, this is while he had been turned back by the Romans, he came to the conclusion that Judea was in revolt. That is when Jason pushed Menelaus out of the high priesthood. He therefore set out from Egypt, raging like a wild beast, and took the city, Jerusalem, by storm. He then ordered his soldiers to cut down mercilessly everyone they met and to slay those who fled to their houses. So not only did his soldiers murder people in the streets, they followed people into their homes and murdered them. Does this sound like an event that took place in southern Israel? Maybe a little bit, about 12 months ago. There was the massacre of young and old, the extermination of women and children, and the slaughter of young girls and infants. In the course of 3 days, there were 80,000 victims, 40,000 killed in hand-to-hand fighting, and another 40 sold into slavery. So, guys, these are the historical events. This is the historical fulfillment of a passage that also has an eschatological end times fulfillment. Okay, so what we're reading now is a preview, a precursor to what comes after the final king of the north at the end of the age turns in rage against the Holy Covenant. Keep that in mind as we're reading here. Not content with this, the king, that is Antiochus, had the audacity to enter the holiest temple in the entire world with Menelaus, that is his puppet high priest, who had become a traitor to the laws and to his country, serving as his guide. The king laid his unclean hands on the sacred vessels, and with his profane hands he gathered up the votive offerings that other kings had made to enhance the glory and the honor of the holy place. So he ransacked and plundered the temple. Not long afterward, this is now chapter 6 of 2 Maccabees, not long afterward, the king sent an Athenian senator to force the Jews to forsake the laws of their ancestors and to live no longer in accordance with the laws of God. He was also instructed to profane the temple in Jerusalem and dedicate it to Olympian Zeus, and to dedicate the sanctuary on Mount Gerizim to Zeus the Hospitable, as had been requested by the people who inhabited that place. This evil onslaught harshly and intensified the grievous distress of the people. The Gentiles made the temple a center of debauchery, that is the Greek occupiers, and licentious revelry, as they used the sacred precincts of immoral pleasures with prostitutes and intercourse with women. They also brought into the temple sacrificial offerings that were forbidden, so that the altar was covered with abominable offerings that were prohibited by the law. So we don't know how much of this is specifically applicable to the eschatological fulfillment of this. I think scripturally speaking, based on what we read in Daniel 11, and what we can read in other places like, say for instance, Zechariah 12 through 14, and Isaiah 32, and Ezekiel 38. This is going to be a time when the final king of the north, when he is stopped by the ships of Kittim. And it says in Scripture, not that a rumor spreads that he had died, but that he actually does suffer a mortal head wound. So the sort of historical preview is just a rumor that Antiochus had died. But in the eschatological fulfillment, there actually is some kind of death event, some kind of mortal head wound for the beast. And when he is revived, whether that means actual literal death and return from death in some sense, or something else, he is literally indwelt by Satan, by the dragon, according to Revelation 13, and goes on this rage against the Holy Covenant. And so what we can expect to see then is something like the verses I just read about the slaughter in Jerusalem. Because remember, Jesus says, as soon as you see that abomination of desolation set up in the temple, get out of the city. You don't even have time to get your stuff together. You don't even have time to pack a bag. You just need to get out and run for the hills. And in a separate portion of this passage, it talks about the Maccabean family fleeing into the wilderness, the ones who would eventually lead a rebellion against the Greeks and kick them out. So we can expect to see that kind of horror in the city of Jerusalem, not unlike what we saw around the Gaza Strip on October 7th, 2023. And we don't know if it'll be pagan. It probably won't be pagan worship like what we're reading about here, but there will be a sense in which there is an abomination set up in the temple. And it's prophetically speaking, as far as Scripture is concerned, Islam would be a pagan religion. It's certainly derived from the Arabic pagan religion that was common in the Arabian Peninsula in the 6th century when Muhammad came to power. The Kaaba, the central shrine in Islam, was a pagan shrine before Muhammad co-opted it into Islam, and he also co-opted a lot of pagan rituals, Arabic pagan rituals, into Islam. So we don't know exactly what form these different types of defilements will take in the eschatological fulfillment of the abomination that causes desolation, except that the temple will be defiled, and according to Revelation 11, the holy place will be given over to the nations to trample it for 1,260 days. Continuing on with this passage, no one was allowed to keep the Sabbath or to observe the traditional feasts or even to admit to being a Jew. So Jews were not allowed to identify as Jews or practice Judaism anymore. Quick point here, we can see this type of dynamic at work in Islamic society now. For instance, in Turkey, where Kurdish people, even though they're Muslim, they're an ethnic minority. Kurdish people are not allowed to identify as Kurds. They're referred to as Mountain Turks. They're not allowed to speak Kurdish or to exercise or to celebrate Kurdish language or culture or tradition in Turkey or in the Turkish occupied parts of Syria. So we see this kind of dynamic at work, that when these sort of Islamist regimes take over, that the people that they oppress aren't even able to express their identity in any sense. And so this would certainly be the case, that there would be an expectation that when this final king of the north conquers the Holy Land, conquers and takes over the state of Israel, dissolves the political state of Israel. We don't know for sure that this guy will be a Muslim, but he certainly will be arising from what are Muslim nations today. That if he's expected or believed to be the Mahdi, the Islamic Messiah figure, that there is a requirement at that point in Islamic eschatology that everyone, including both Jews and Christians, convert to Islam. There's no more tolerance of Judaism or Christianity, where you are dhimmis and second-class citizens who pay the jizya and have to submit yourself to all these kinds of public humiliations. You now have to convert or die. And we see this dynamic at work in the historical fulfillment of Daniel 11, that Jewish people were not allowed to identify as Jewish. They could not observe the Sabbath or the traditional feasts. Furthermore, on the monthly celebration of the king's birthday, the Jews were forcibly compelled to partake in the sacrificial victims. And when the festival of Dionysus, a Greek god, was celebrated, they were forced to wear wreaths of ivy and take part in the procession honoring him. So not only were they not allowed to be Jews, they were forcibly converted, at least outwardly, to observe the religion of the king of the north. At the suggestion of the citizens of Ptolemais, a decree was issued to the neighboring Greek cities ordering them to adopt the same policies towards the Jews, compel them to partake of the sacrifices, and put to death those who refused to conform to Greek customs. Thus it was clear that disaster was imminent. Okay, so those are some of the ways that this passage in Daniel 11 was fulfilled historically under Antiochus IV, and how he persecuted and oppressed the Jewish people, and how his rage against the covenant people and against the covenant itself, the God of the covenant, was expressed. Okay, so this is the point in the passage where we begin to shift. We've been talking between verse 21 and verse 36. So for those 15 verses, we've been talking about both historical and eschatological applications for this passage. So it's almost like the historical application is kind of like an on-ramp for us, right? And now we're on the freeway. The freeway of the end of the age, the eschatological end times freeway. And we're going to start getting into verses that don't have a historical application. We can't relate these following verses per se to Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay, in fact, there's going to be some events described here that have no historical fulfillment at all, so they must be entirely future. So again, a short interlude here about the King of the North, We read earlier about his character, and now a little bit more about his character now that he has been indwelt by the dragon, has gotten this supernatural power, and has betrayed all of the things that he had portrayed previously. The first half of the week, he's portraying himself one way. The last half of the week, he betrays that portrayal and shows himself to be what he truly is. He shows his true colors, according to 2 Thessalonians 2, when he sits in God's place in the temple, thereby declaring himself to be God. Okay, so that is the revelation of what Paul calls the mystery of iniquity that's remaining hidden now, restrained for now. At the beginning of the Great Tribulation, Satan shows his cards. He's been cast down to the earth. He knows his time is short. He goes into full rage. Okay, so here is the description of this satanically empowered king of the north. And he shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishingly things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. So he's leading this indignation against God and his covenant and against his covenant people for a time, what Daniel calls in another passage, I believe it's Daniel 11, times and half a time. Actually, Daniel 12 as well. So this is the time for what is decreed to be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or to the one beloved by women. That is being a reference to the Messiah. Remember Luke 2, Mary says, all women shall honor me now as the one who's giving birth to the Messiah. So he shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or to the one beloved by women, to the God of the Bible. He shall not pay attention to any other God, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these. So his God is a militaristic God who builds fortresses and conquers and wins wars. Sound like any religion we know in the world today. Sound like a God we know worshipped by 1.5 billion people today. A God whom his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him, he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many and shall divide the land, which in context in Daniel is always a reference to the glorious land, the land of Israel. He shall divide the land for a price. Okay, so he continues to be an astute politician, a military leader, and he is at the height of his power early on in this great tribulation, this indignation against God and his people. Last few verses here. At the time of the end. End of what? End of the age. The king of the south shall attack him. Now, this did not happen historically. So there's going to be one more rebellion as the kings of the south, based in Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula, as they see this man with unchecked power and accumulating riches overthrow the state of Israel. There's going to be one more war where they come against the king of the north. But it says the king of the south this time shall rush upon him, that is the king of the south, like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and with many ships. He's got a big navy, he's got a big mechanized army, and he's going to it says, he shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. So this last final war is not one in which he's stopped by the ships of Kittim. Now satanically empowered, now in this final jihad, we might call it, this great war of the Great Tribulation. He overflows and passes through countries. He seems unstoppable. And we don't know for sure how big this war will get. I imagine if there's not a World War III before this, this is World War III for sure. Into Africa, without a doubt. Into Europe, without a doubt. Into Central and Southern Asia, without a doubt. This man is going to overflow in every direction across countries. And this time, the ships of Kittim won't be able to stop him. As we read earlier when we were talking about the ships of Kittim, here in Numbers 24, it says, ships shall come from Kittim and shall afflict Asher and Eber, and he too shall come to utter destruction. That is, the ships of Kittim will experience destruction under the mighty hand, the satanically empowered hand of the king of the north. Okay, so this doesn't apply to Antiochus Epiphanes. He died shortly after this in a war again in Persia. This can only apply to the final eschatological king of the north. He, the king of the north, shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall. Remember what we read in 2 Maccabees earlier. But these shall be delivered out of his hand. So there shall be a country that he doesn't conquer, Edom and Moab, and the main part of the Ammonites. Territorially, that is the modern nation of Jordan. So you can harmonize this verse together with Jesus' command to his disciples in Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, where he says, flee into the wilderness, which is east of the city of Jerusalem, into the Judean hills. Why? Because that's the way to get to Jordan. And also Revelation 12, it says, the woman who represents Israel with 12 stars over her head was given wings to escape the dragon into the desert, into the wilderness, where she shall be cared for in the desert for times and half a time. So there shall be a remnant of people in Judea at that time, I believe both Jews and Gentiles, the Maskilim, who heed the warning of Jesus in Matthew 24, and who escape from the city, who leave immediately like he tells them to, and escape the city before this very quick outbreak of persecution begins in the Great Tribulation throughout the city of Jerusalem. And they make it over the Judean hills into Jordan. And it says in Revelation 12 that the dragon lets loose this flood out of his mouth, representative of an army. The language of flood is the language of armies, as we read here. He shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through, like a flood overflows and passes through. But there's one place that his flood will be stopped, and that is in the nation of Jordan. It says that the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the army of the dragon in Revelation 12. Don't know how that's going to be fulfilled eschatologically. It'll be miraculous for sure. But the army of the Antichrist will be stopped, and he will never be able to overtake those who escape the city into the wilderness. They'll be cared there for and protected there by the Lord throughout the Great Tribulation for times and half time. He, verse 42, the king of the north, shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So this time he takes Egypt. There's nobody to stop him. No ships of Kittim to rescue the king of Egypt. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. Libyans, obviously a reference to modern-day Libya. Cushites, biblical Cush is modern-day Sudan, which joined with the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco in the Abraham Accords in 2020. And there is now a civil war being fought in in Sudan, partially provoked by that peace treaty. But news from the east and from the north shall alarm him. So there's something happening east of the king of the north's empire and north of the king's empire that's a threat to him. We won't go much into this today because that could be a whole nother 30 minutes to an hour teaching bringing in the book of Revelation to this. But we know at some point towards the end of the Great Tribulation, there's a great army that marches from the east across the river Euphrates that's been dried up. And so it seems that what's left of the world that isn't under the control of the king of the north is now raising a mighty army that comes against him. Now, the east isn't defined here. The north isn't defined here. Is this a reference to China, India, Russia? We don't know. Okay? It's some news that comes from that region that alarms him. And historically, this is actually a verse that does apply to Antiochus. During his war against the Jews in the Holy Land, he had to break off from it and leave one of his generals over the Maccabean revolt in order to go fight a war against the Persians, and that's where he died. Persia in modern-day Iran. So at some point, the final king of the north, when he's at the height of his power, there will be some kind of league that it seems like that comes against him. What form that will take, what nations those will be, we don't know. But once he's fully subdued the entire Middle East, including those three horns that he plucks up, according to Daniel 7, which I would interpret as being Egypt, Cush, and Libya. Really at the height of his power, when he seems unstoppable, there's this kind of final alliance that comes against him, to use a term for Lord of the Rings. Just like in Lord of the Rings, the final alliance of men and elves comes against Mordor. I think this will be some kind of final alliance against nations that comes against the final king of the north. Could be wrong. That's how I interpret this passage when I harmonize it with other passages. And he shall pitch, the king of the north shall pitch his palatial tents. He shall make his base between the sea, the great sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and the glorious holy mountain. What is the glorious holy mountain? The Temple Mount in Jerusalem. If you visit Israel today, Tel Aviv, the coastal city where Ben Gurion Airport is, that's where you'll fly in. If you're going to Jerusalem, you're going to get a car and you're going to get on Highway 1, which is the highway that runs between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Right about there is where this final king of the north will set up his final base for his last stand, between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Yet he shall come to his end, with none to help him. Something's going to happen. When all the nations are gathered there together to war against each other, when God, through those demonic frog demons, if you read about them in the bowl judgments in Revelation, this final great mass of armies from all these nations come against one another in this territory between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Something happens that brings this man, this final king of the north, this beast of Revelation 13, to his end, where there's nothing that can help him. There's no power, no demonic, satanic power that can possibly deliver him from what comes against him. And that won't be the armies from the north and the east, if that's what happens, ultimately, prophetically speaking. That will be the armies of heaven, guys. That will be Jesus splitting the sky and coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones. And as these armies are gathered together to fight against each other, an even greater army, an infinitely more powerful army, comes against all of them. As it says in Joel 2, that God will draw all the nations together in the valley of Jehoshaphat, the valley below the ancient city, the old city of Jerusalem. And there he will enter into judgment against them. And you might say, well, Gabe, I thought Armageddon, the Battle of Armageddon, is fought near the Valley of Megiddo, which is actually kind of central Israel towards the Galilee. That's not near Jerusalem. Again, I encourage everyone to read Michael Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm, and his chapter. I believe it's an entire chapter he wrote on Armageddon. and how he believes that John was not referencing Megiddo because there's actually, historically, there was no mountain in Megiddo at all. Tel Megiddo, or Har, the mountain of Megiddo, is actually a tell. It's an archaeological mound of an ancient city that didn't exist because it was a city in ancient times. There was no mountain in Megiddo. It's a flat plain, if you've ever been there. It's a bunch of fields. And he believes that the Greek translation, Har-Megiddon, is of the Hebrew phrase Har, or mountain, o Mogeddod. That is of the holy place, the holy assembly. A moed is like a holy assembly in Hebrew. In the Hebrew letter there, ayin would have had like a guttural G sound in the ancient world. It's not pronounced at all today, it's silent. But back then it would have been Har-Megod or something like that. Sorry, I don't speak Hebrew very well. I don't pronounce Hebrew very well. So Kaiser makes the case that Armageddon is actually John's Greek translation of Ar-Megod, or the mountain of the holy assembly. And what is the mountain of the holy assembly? It is Jerusalem. Okay, this could be supported, for instance, if you read Isaiah chapter 14, the description of Satan's rebellion against God and also the Antichrist's rebellion against the covenant, stating that he will put his throne on the Mount of Holy Assembly. So I don't believe that this ultimate final battle of the age is going to be fought in a field in the Galilee. I do agree with Heiser that this final battle, the Battle of Armageddon, is fought in the valleys and the territory, the land around the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is ultimately the prize, both for the kings of the earth, the human kings of the earth, and the principalities of powers. It's the holy city, the city of God. And so I believe that this final king of the north is going to set up his last stand between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and that's where the final battle of the age is going to take place, both between the armies of the earth and then ultimately as the army of heaven intervenes. Okay. All right, I think I'm going to end it there, guys. I'll take questions here for a few minutes, but it's been a couple hours. Told you this would be a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's a long passage, and I wanted to be thorough going all the way through it. So we've reached the end of the chapter. If there's anybody left, then you're welcome to post your questions here. I've seen you guys chatting back and forth with each other, so that's great to see you interacting with one another. Hopefully you're doing that respectfully and in love for one another as brothers. Tiki71 makes a comment, Gog falls on the mountains of Israel, Moriah, Olive, Scopus, etc. Yes. And really the Judean hills are representative of the entire nation of Israel, right? It's an idiom, as Joel talks about in Mideast Beast, in his chapters on Ezekiel 38. The hills, or the mountains of Israel, is an idiom for the entire nation. So yes, I would believe most properly that could be interpreted as Jerusalem. And the hill, if you've ever been to Jerusalem, you know it's surrounded by mountains. So, any other questions? Someone mentioned Jelani calling for the caliphate. I haven't seen Jelani himself. Of course, he's too slick of a politician to be making those kinds of claims yet. I have seen some of his videos of some of his followers calling for him to be caliph. So, you know, if he's the guy, and that's a big if, we don't know that yet, right? He definitely fits, if we go all the way back to verse 21, he definitely fits some of the characteristics, and his rise to power in Syria certainly fits some of the description here in verses 21 through 23, right? So he's a contemptible, despicable person, former member of Al-Qaeda who killed Americans in Iraq, led al-Qaeda's chapter in northwest Syria, al-Nusra Front, during the early days of the Syrian Revolution, but then who has become a more enlightened, tolerant version of himself since then, at least publicly speaking. He has not been given royal majesty. He is not in the line of succession of the Assad regime. He was not elected to power in Syria, and although he's promising elections, we can expect those probably wouldn't be free and fair. And now he's talking about 4 years before there's elections. He certainly came into power without warning. Nobody expected, even the greatest experts, did not expect this to happen. For him to break out of Idlib province and within a week and a half take Damascus. I mean, that was just, nobody was expecting that. Charles Lister, one of the foremost experts on the Syrian civil war, if you follow him, and I suggest you do, we don't always agree with Charles, especially regarding Israel and the Gaza war or regards to the Kurds in Syria. He's kind of he's kind of favorable towards Turkey and some of the Turkish factions in Syria. But he's a great source of information nonetheless. And he was completely taken aback by this. Nobody expected this. And he certainly obtained the kingdom by flatteries. Over the course of the last 4 years, he's made a lot of alliances with a small people, you could say, in Idlib province, right near the border of Turkey, right? Actually not too far away from the seat of the Seleucid Empire, which is biblical Antioch, today in southern Turkey, right across the border, just a couple of 100 kilometers across the border from Syria and Turkey. He certainly made alliances with the Turks, with other Syrian revolutionary factions to come to power. He certainly swept the Syrian army away before him and broke it. Again, I won't get into Prince of the Covenant. That's a landmine that I won't step on right now. That could be its own session, and maybe it will be at some point here in the near future. We'll dig into who the Prince of the Covenant is and how that can be interpreted. From the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully. Well, we could see how that might apply to al-Jilani. From the time that he's made alliances with the other Syrian factions and with Turkey, and now is in talks with other Arab states and with Western nations, including the United States and Britain, we would have to be pretty gullible and naive to believe that he is a reformed jihadist, that he is now some sort of tolerant, ecumenical leader of Syria who wants to respect everybody's ethnicity and religion and just wants to bring about a democratic process for a free Syria. If we really believe that he's left his past behind him and that he's become this man, then we, I would say, are probably in danger of being deceived by him. And he certainly became strong with a small people. So all these things, I would say, definitely do apply to al-Jilani. That doesn't mean he's the guy. He could be another prefigurement. He could be, or another precursor to the King of the North. We don't know. And as I said in the previous live stream, I kind of take the, when the Jewish sages suggest that somebody might be the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, they have a list of qualifications, and they say, well, when the guy meets all these qualifications, then we can say that he's probably the guy, right? He's probably the Messiah. I apply that same sort of interpretive method to deciding who this man, the Antichrist, will be. Well, we know his scriptural bio, so to speak, right? His characteristics, his character, and the things that he will accomplish. When we see him doing these things, we can say he's probably the guy. I would say we probably won't know for certain until that covenant with for 1/7 is made that includes Israel, and most likely that's the covenant that allows Jewish Levitical worship to resume on the Temple Mount. Right now, the Jewish state controls the Temple Mount politically and security-wise, but they have given religious control of the Temple Mount to the Jordanian Waqf, who does not allow, officially speaking anyway,
Jews or Christians or any other religion to pray or sing or worship in any manner on the Temple Mount besides Muslims. So that's still the status quo on the Temple Mount. At some point, that will have to change. Whether that happens before or after as part of this covenant of 1:7, we shall see. But certainly it seems those two things go together in Daniel. So I'd say if Al-Jilani is the guy, he's certainly a little horn type of person. If he's the guy that makes a 10-nation confederation and somehow gains political power over those 10 nations, which would have to include Turkey, not clear how that could happen right now. And it would also include Iraq and Iran. Not sure how that could happen right now. He's certainly not in the position of power to take power over those nations right now in any sense. And what kind of political control that will be, we don't know either. He may not necessarily be the direct ruler of those nations. Those nations are the 10 toes, the brittle toes of Daniel 2, iron mixed with clay. So it may not be a contiguous empire as much as a confederation or an alliance of 10 nations. And he's just the leader of it. So as the dynamic exists now, Erdogan certainly wouldn't be willing to report to Al-Jilani. It would be the other way around. There would have to be a shift in dynamic for that to happen. But he, as I said, he certainly fits these verses very, very well. And it's certainly somebody worth watching right now. And if nothing else, is a good reminder of how close we might be to this final 7, the end of the age, and how fervently and intentionally we ought to be living our lives for the Lord and doing our work as the Maskilim to make many understand, that is to take the gospel of the kingdom to the nations. Donna, is KC King Charles? Oh, maybe you're asking somebody that question. KC3. I would say that King Charles most certainly isn't the Antichrist, nor is Hillary Clinton or Obama or Trump or any other Western politician. The Bible repeatedly states, Daniel 11 in reference to the Seleucid kingdom, the king of the north, in Isaiah 10 through 14 in reference to the Assyrian, and in Ezekiel 38 in reference to Gog of Magog, all pseudonyms for the Antichrist, all other names for him. They all point to the territory which today are the modern nations of Turkey, Syria, and northern Iraq. Okay, is where those empires and territories and nations were based historically. So the prophets keep pointing to those territories as the territory from which this figure will arise. Okay, so I would say we're getting distracted if we're looking at any other figure from any other part of the world, any other nation of the world. Yeah, King Charles is very interesting. I mean, keep in mind, guys, this guy is very seductive, as we just read in Daniel chapter 11, and very deceitful, as we just read in this passage. From the time an alliance is made with him, the alliance that allows him to come to power, he shall act deceitfully. And there is certainly this infatuation in the Western world with Islamists who portray themselves as Democrats. But as Democrats, I don't mean the Democratic Party. I'm referring to liberal Democrats, those who believe in liberal democracy. We saw that during the Arab Spring with the Obama administration and other Western nations in the EU, and Mohamed Morsi in Egypt. We see it today in Tunisia, the original country in the Arab Spring, where an Islamist, Muslim Brotherhood-friendly government came to power there and is still in power there. We see that today with the faction of the Libyan civil war that is allied with the Western nations and Turkey, that is an Islamist government. They portray themselves as believing in democracy, and this is exactly Al-Jilani's tactic, portraying himself as being a democratic leader who wants to institute democracy or the will of the people, but who is a radical Islamist. And that goes all the way back to the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1920s, after the fall of the last Islamic Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate in 1923 through 24, when the Ottoman Empire was dismantled at the end of World War I, and the last caliph, the last sultan of the Ottoman Empire was deposed. A school teacher in Egypt led a movement that became the Muslim Brotherhood that taught that modern democracy is the vehicle by which Islamic government returns to the Middle East. And that's been the tactic of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in Turkey, and in other places in the Middle East, in Libya, ever since. Now, there are sort of jihadist elements like Al-Qaeda and ISIS that just go for gusto and wage jihad without trying to be popularly elected in the meantime. Right? But the Muslim Brotherhood tactic, and the tactic that al-Jilani's taking, even though he did win in a jihad, you could call it, and take Damascus by military conquest, he is nonetheless using that very tried and true tactic of Islamists in the Muslim Brotherhood, which is to come to power through popular elections in order to impose an Islamic government over a nation. And it's been the dictators, the strongmen of the Middle East that have been a restraining power against that ever since the 1920s through the 1980s, 1990s. Beginning with the fall of Saddam Hussein in the Iraq War, followed by the Arab Spring, the fall of Hosni Mubarak, and other strongmen across the Middle East. That's when we've seen the rise of these Islamic movements with that sort of secular dictatorship restraint removed. And we've seen it yet again in Syria. So yeah, I think, Western leaders like King Charles and Ken Starmer and Joe Biden, and I don't even want to exclude Trump from this, guys. Regardless of what your politics may be, this individual is going to be very, very, very convincing. And he's going to deceive a lot of world leaders who are going to tolerate him at least up until that midpoint of the 70th week when he overplays his hand and the ships of the Qatim come against him. Right? So that's when the West kind of wises up that, hey, this guy's a little more ambitious and a little less democratic and tolerant than we thought. And they intervene. And then literally all hell breaks loose. All right. Well, thanks again, guys. It's been almost 2.5 hours. So before I lose my voice or pass out here at my desk, I'm going to let you go. And obviously we're going to be doing this more, right? This is just one teaching. We finished the book of Revelation. We're already talking. Steph and Joel and I are talking about what we'd like to do next year for teaching series, and I think I'll be spending some more time in Daniel with you guys, and what may come out of that, in our broader Maranatha series, we'll see. So this is just the beginning. We're going to keep an eye on things. Please continue following the wire. Please continue praying with us. More than just, prophecy watchers, we are actually doing the work in the Middle East. We have field workers that are sowing the seeds of the gospel of the kingdom among unreached people groups, because that is ultimately our commission from the Lord himself to be doing during the season. That is, as Jesus says, once that gospel of the kingdom has been proclaimed through the whole earth as a testimony to all nations, then the end will come. So the way in which we hasten the Lord's return is
is the way in which we spread that gospel of the kingdom among unreached people groups. And for us, that means in the Middle East, Muslim majority nations. And who knows, maybe among those nations, Muslim background believers now are some of the future masculine of the Great Tribulation. Maybe some of them will be those that care for Jewish refugees and those who managed to escape captivity during the Great Tribulation, and those who are wise and can make many understand. And so the work we do for the gospel of the kingdom among Muslim people groups not only serves the ultimate purpose of gaining for Jesus the inheritance which he purchased with his blood, as it says in Revelation 5, with your blood you purchased men for God from every tribe, nation, and language, made them a kingdom of priests to serve our God. That is the ultimate purpose of this work, is we're building that kingdom priesthood that lasts into eternity. But even in the short term, if it is in fact short, those kind of gospel islands, you could call them, those embassies of the kingdom of God among the hostile nations of the Middle East, will serve an important purpose, we believe, in the Great Tribulation, in sheltering, caring for, and shepherding Jewish refugees. So, sobering things to think about and pray about, guys, and to consider. Please continue to partner with us in this work and with other trusted ministry partners that we have and other groups and believers that are sowing into this work in the Middle East. We'll be back. We'll continue talking about these things. Follow us on the wire at FAI_wire on X. If you're not on X, it might be worth dipping your toe into the toxic sludge just so that you can follow us. We do our best to kind of curate sources out there. So we get the question a lot, who should we be following? We don't necessarily agree with all the sources that we post about, but we try to pass along good information for you and help you to interpret those sources and that information as necessary. So really we act more as curators of that information. And obviously we have friends on the ground there too that have a helpful perspective in these things. So, all right, 12:34 Western time, 3:34 Eastern. Love you guys. Blessings to you. We'll see you soon. Happy New Year, Chag Sameach, and Maranatha.